Hey guys, welcome back to another video here on the channel. Sorry this one took a little bit longer to get out. There has been a little bit of work being done behind the scenes, so we have just had to, get a couple of things sorted. But we are back again, and we are changing direction somewhat. I know the last couple of weeks we've been focusing a little bit on some German tank destroyers. We are now just going to switch quickly into talking about probably one of the most well-known early tanks used by the Germans. This is the Panzer III. So obviously, as we all know, this is the tank that would be used by the German army from 1939 right up until about 1943 when it's finally phased out. So in order for us to get a full understanding of the development behind the Panzer III, we just have to take a very brief look into what German armour doctrine was going to be during this time. So throughout the early 30s, the Germans are entering the new lines of thinking, which will ultimately culminate in the Blitzkrieg doctrine. Inspired by Heinz Guderian and other prominent panzer commanders, medium tanks and German service were to have two primary objectives. The first of these was going to be to assist friendly infantry in making breakthroughs in the front by targeting hard points and then exploiting these gaps when resistance had been removed, attacking rear areas and lines of communications. The other role that they were going to have was to engage enemy armoured vehicles and tanks, which for this it would require a good anti-tank gun. On the 11th of January 1934, the Army Weapons Department draws up plans based upon the specifications laid out by Heinz Guderian for the creation of a new medium tank. The maximum weight of the vehicle is originally meant to be no more than 15 tons, but is then pushed up to about 24 tons to make things easier on the designers, and it's supposed to be able to reach a speed of about 35 kilometers an hour. The new vehicle is intended to fill the ranks of the Panzer divisions in partnership with the Panzer IV. Video about that will be done as well. The Panzer IV was to act as a support vehicle. It would attack machine guns and anti-tank positions, as well as other fixed positions with its heavy gun, which was to be the 75mm howitzer sort of weapon, whilst the Panzer III would target enemy armoured forces. The Panzer IV would be heavier and be more heavily armoured than the Panzer III, but would not be involved so much in staying with infantry in every engagement. This is the thing that's often forgotten about the Panzer IV. The intention of it is, yes, it can help friendly infantry, but it's not the primary role of it. That role was to be left to the Sturmgeschütz III. The role of the Panzer IV is to engage enemy anti-tank guns, which can threaten friendly armoured forces. The Panzer III would not be able to do this so effectively. So under development, the Panzer III has prototypes developed initially by Daimler-Benz, MAN and Rheinmetall starting in the early 1930s, about 35. Testing of these prototypes is conducted throughout 1936 to 1937 and leads to the selection of the Daimler-Benz design for production. The first model is known as the Ausf A. Obviously Ausf meaning like model, and this is obviously model A. This vehicle would only have a production run of 10 vehicles, which would be finished in May of 1937. It's key to know that every model from Ausf A to Ausf D are deemed prototypes by the Germans. They see them all as just being test beds for what will be the eventual Panzer III, so they will all see combat at some point. So the tank is powered by a 250 PS HL108 engine, which allows it to reach a speed of roughly 30 kilometers an hour, so nearly what the Germans were after. And it allows for a range of about 165 kilometers, which is a very respectable feat for a tank of this time. The A is armoured with 15mm of armour all around, a trait that would be one of the first things that was to change about these designs. This is an issue in early wartime because anti-tank rifles are still fielded by most European armies. The Brits are fielding them, the Soviets have them, I don't think the French do, but the Poles have them especially. The 15mm of armour is just not enough to protect against even that. So armed with the 3.7cm KWK-36 L46.5 main gun and two coaxial 7.92mm MG34 machine guns, it would also have an additional machine gun in the hull. The armament, especially the 37mm, becomes the standard for the Panzer III for several models. It would only end up becoming replaced when it became clear that this gun really wasn't what was required. One of the most striking things about the Ausf A, which makes it really quite recognisable from most of its other Panzer III brothers, is the suspension. The suspension consists of 5 road wheels dampened by coil springs and 2 return rollers. Most other vehicles of this class will end up having significantly different designs. They'll end up changing the suspension multiple times in the Ausf B, or the Ausf A. Sorry, they'll change the design multiple times in order to finally get a suspension that they actually enjoy. The Ausf A was capable again of reaching about 30 kilometers an hour. There are claims that they managed to get it up to 35 kilometers an hour. This is contested. In total, it had a weight of 15.4 tons, a length of 5.69 meters, a width of 2.81 meters, and a height of 2.34 meters. So by this point, we then move on to the Ausf B variant, which enters production literally as soon as the Ausf A finishes in May 1937. Some changes are made. Particularly is the upgrading of armour. The hull receives an additional 10mm of thickness, taking it to 25mm thick. Still not fantastic, but better than what they're dealing with prior to this. It makes the Panzers slightly more durable. The most significant change, however, does come in the suspension. The 5-wheel suspension is replaced by an 8-wheeled variation, which does again have coil springs, but it's designed to reduce the load on the tanks for later models. Again, the production run of this vehicle is 15 vehicles. In 1937, it is significantly less than what will eventually come on to be the main majority of the tanks, but again, this one is deemed a prototype. Virtually all of these vehicles will be replaced from service by 1940. They see service in Poland, as does the Ausf A for that matter, but the Ausf A and the Ausf B both are replaced from service in 1940. They're just not very good. They really aren't very good in these kind of scenarios. There's too few of them that justify the spare parts, so they are just replaced. They're issued to Panzer units in about 1937 and are replaced by February of 1940. They are eventually converted, the Ausf Bs. 5 of them are converted into the Sturmgeschütz armoured vehicle, which is they are highly successful in. Again, armament is one 37mm gun with 2 MG34 machine guns in alongside the gun in the coax position, and then 1 MG34 in the hull. The engine remains the same. The gearbox actually loses 1 forward gear, going down to 5 from 6. Weight is 15.9 tons, so it's slightly up on the Ausf A. Apart from that, everything else pretty much remains the same. It's the same length, roughly. It's the same width, and it's only slightly taller. The only significant difference in that regard being that the commander's cupola is slightly taller. This brings us on to the Ausf C variant. This has a run of 15 vehicles again, which again kicks up almost as soon as the Ausf B production is finished. So it begins up production in 1937, which ends in the start of the new year. This one again only has a slight modification. Everything else remains the same. Literally everything, like the height and that, nothing changes. The thing about it that is different over it is that it still has 8 road wheels on each side. However, there is a change in the suspension it uses. It changes to a leaf spring suspension, which is a direction the Germans will attempt to go in the near future. In terms of combat service, the vehicles are issued by the 20th of January 1938. They are issued throughout parts of the army. They see combat in Poland and are then withdrawn again in February of 1940, which is a thing you'll see. This is the thing about the early vehicles. They see service in Poland, that's it, done. Get them out, they're not very good. The Ausf D is where we see the change that the Germans want to start to introduce. Now, the Ausf D is where production really starts to ramp up. 30 vehicles of this variety will be produced between January and June of 1938. Again, the vehicle weighs nowhere near the 30-ton limit which is given for it. It weighs about 16 tons, it has a length of 5.29 metres, a width of 2.82 metres, and a height of 2.42 metres. The engine remains the same apart from one major feature. It is upgraded engine, which is introduced with, known as the TR variant of the same engine. It basically, the 108 engine gives this engine a slightly bit of a kick up the bum. It takes it from about 250 horsepower up to about 270 horsepower. It's not a lot, but it'll do the job. So again, the only real change with this vehicle is the need for an improved suspension. There is a slight upgrading of the armour as well that goes alongside this. Armour is up to about 30mm on the front. And then on the sides and the back, as well, is introduced. The whole design is slightly modified on the rear section, just for apparently there's an issue with some of the rear designs with the chassis. They modify it slightly. It's not really noticeable. 5 vision slits are also added in the hull to help the crews spot targets and hopefully defend themselves from close-ranged infantry assault. 25 of these vehicles are built in 1938, and then an additional 5 are built in 1940. These are largely, however, rebuilds, which are done for training vehicles. So it's they basically get built as training vehicles because this is the vehicle that will end up being the main training vehicle up until the Germans decide to replace this. So the suspension is again improved over various vehicles. The inclining of the leaf springs basically give more support to the actual vehicle. The design of obviously the rear deck and the rear hull is changed to improve armour protection, and there is a little bit of modification to the commander's cupola. So during 1938, the official organisation called for 3 Panzerkampfwagen 3s in a platoon as part of the light tank company for each armoured detachment. Thus, each Panzer regiment was to have only 6 Panzerkampfwagen 3s in each Panzer division. After action in Poland, the Ausf D is withdrawn from service along February 1940. Its frontline service was lengthened by several months. However, when the D was issued, the Panzerabteilung ZV40, so Tank Detachment for Special Employment 40, which fights in Norway. So these guys basically become part of the detachment alongside the really weird multi-turreted German heavy tanks that go to Norway to basically impose the German army's force there, because really the Norwegians don't have any armour at all, so this thing really couldn't go wrong. We finally get into the good stuff. The Ausf E becomes the Germans' first real series production vehicle. Its production will run from December of 1938 to October of 1939, producing 96 vehicles in total. The basic design remains unchanged throughout the rest of the series after this, as a result of the adaptation of a successful suspension system supported by torsion bars. They finally pick a suspension that they like. They pick the torsion bar. Finally, the Germans have got what they wanted. This tank also sees a number of significant changes which we need to go into. The armour is again upgraded. 30mm of armour all over the tank. Okay, this now makes the tank relatively impervious to most anti-tank rifles and a lot of anti-tank guns which are being used, especially the 20mm, which is being used by the Poles. Weight does increase. It does jump significantly. It actually goes up by 3.5 tons to 19.5 tons. But they also get a new engine as a result. The new engine which is introduced is the Maybach HL120TR engine. This is capable of producing 300 horsepower, which puts the vehicle in. It actually means that this vehicle is one of the fastest in its class by the time of its production. This is further improved by the fact the Germans put a very good gearbox inside it. Okay, it's a very good gearbox. 10 forward gears, 4 reverse gears. The tank can be put across most terrain without having an issue, because the crew can put it into whatever gear it needs to get it going. Okay. Again, we see the change to a torsion bar suspension. This becomes a suspension that the Germans will use for the rest of the war. Armament was also changed somewhat. Early variants kept the 3.7cm KWK gun. They kept the KWK-36 for a number of years until about 1942. They get converted to have the 5cm KWK-L42 gun. This is mainly in part because they're sort of, after the Battle of France, it's basically realised that the Panzers need better guns. So we have a massive speed increase, we have an increased suspension, better armaments are finally becoming available, armour is significantly improved. The vehicles are basically become the entire bedrock. It's actually kind of funny. This is the first non-prototype vehicle and it becomes pretty much the template for the German army going forward. So in terms of combat service, on the 1st of September 1939 there were only 98 Panzerkampfwagen 3s in the entire army inventory. Okay, 2 of which are actually Panzer III, because I know I said there was 96 vehicles, 2 of these are command vehicles. The production of the Ausf E had allowed a slight increase in the official organisation from 3 to 5 Panzerkampfwagen 3s per platoon of light tank companies. However, production delays in the formation of special organisations, such as the Panzer Lehr Armoured Training Detachment, meant that some panzer divisions in Poland were without a single Panzerkampfwagen 3. The service life of the Ausf E was extended by rearming them with the 5cm gun, and from 1943 they would be converted into armoured observation vehicles. So these vehicles do actually have a very long service life. They last till about 1942-1943, before being then replaced with tanks like the Panzer IV, the Panther and the Tiger coming into wider ranging service. We're now getting into some of the more well known vehicles. The Ausf F is a slightly modified E. Again, most of these vehicles are all just heavy modifications of the E. Okay, the F is basically designed for mass production, and as a result there are 435 which are produced between September 1939 and July 1940, which is a huge jump. The way they simplify it is also to do partially with, for example, some of the engine changes they do. The engine goes from being the HL120, which we know, to the TRM version. This version is slightly poorer in quality. It produces a higher RPM, but the horsepower is dropped somewhat as a result. It basically means that the gear changes can be a lot more frequent, but the horsepower output is less. The vehicle is still capable of achieving the 40 kilometers an hour, and it only has a slight weight increase. But the point still stands: the tank simplification does have some offsets. So some of these vehicles begin being armed with the 5cm gun from scratch. 100 of these vehicles have the 5cm gun employed on them. Okay, this is the first time we see the Germans realise that they need to make this significant switch. Armour remains the same. Pretty much everything else around the vehicles remains the same. Height is roughly the same. You know, elevation of the gun, whatever. Even the armament remains the same. You still got the two MG34s in the coaxial and one in the hull. Everything else remains the same. Like I said, this is just a modified Ausf E, effectively. There is also a slight modification to the road wheels, however. They're made slightly bigger to ease the ride for the crew, but that's like the only other issue, or the only other change which is made, sorry. We then move on to the Ausf G. Again, this is just another build on the F, effectively. It's effectively an F with thicker armour. The armour is thicker around the rear section of the vehicle. It goes from 21mm to about 30mm, and the gun mantler has 7mm of extra armour placed on it as well. The other-ish thing about the G, however, that should be noted is that the G is the first in the series to accept to be built with the 50mm gun in mind. Okay, its production starts up in April, but it's the first tank in which they pretty much go, right, let's build this thing with the 50mm gun in mind. We might not have enough guns yet, but let's build it just in case. So the G variants come into service as early as June 1940. 600 vehicles will be produced between April 1940 and February 1941. This becomes one of the most common early war tanks seen. A lot of these get sent to North Africa as part of Rommel's campaign there. So early Ausf G production from April to June 1940 were issued as replacements to Panzer regiments at the front in France. Contrary to popular belief, all Panzer Kampfwagen 3s in service in France had the 3.7cm gun. Okay, none of them in France were equipped with the 5cm. The 5cm guns of the G in particular, excuse me, were first produced in July of 1940, so they're around for a while. The 37 survivors are phased out of service in Russia by the end of 1941. Most survivors who mount the 3.7cm gun are converted to mount the 5cm gun, but 54 remained in the army inventory as late as September 1944, mostly probably for training purposes. So again, we're just seeing these are relatively all the same, that just changes a little bit here and there. The Ausf H would be the first vehicle that was built from the start with the 5cm gun in mind. The H sees more armour strapped on where possible. In particular, the front. The front armour is basically given an additional 30mm of armour, which is bolted and welded onto the front and rear of the hull. This is a clear response to the older vehicles being knocked out by weaponry which shouldn't have ever done that. So basically we have about 60mm of frontal armour, but it's not as a solid lump of steel, it's just two bits of steel basically welded together. Besides the fact that this tank has both the 5cm gun from standard, and it has a significant increase in armour, which means that it is largely invulnerable to the likes of the British 2-pounder, the American 37 and the Russian 45. This is literally the only thing that changes. it's the only thing that changes about this tank from its predecessor. Yeah, this happens a lot. So 308 of these vehicles are produced between October 1940 and April 1941, so quite a short production run when you look at it. But they're deemed as they're basically considered a bit of a stopgap measure whilst the newer tanks are brought into service. So in terms of combat service, on the 20th of June 1941, so this is just before Barbarossa breaks out, there were 17 Panzer divisions on the border of the territories held by the Russians. Of these, 6 had been issued with Panzerkampfwagen 38s and 11 were Panzerkampfwagen 3s. Each and every light armoured company had a full complement of 17 Panzerkampfwagen 3s, which gave a total of 960 Panzerkampfwagen 3s, Ausf E's to J's, if those at the detachment and regimental headquarters were included. So, these vehicles are pretty much in service at the start of Operation Barbarossa. They will fight throughout Barbarossa, but will eventually be replaced again in 1943 latest. We shift very briefly now to the Ausf I. Yes, before anyone in the chat blows their mind, the Ausf I variant doesn't exist. This is a well-known fact, the I doesn't exist. This model has been mentioned in Allied dispatches, but it doesn't exist. It's likely this is just a confusion with the Ausf J variant. Okay. Speaking of, the Ausf J is one of the most common Panzer IIIs that you'll find. 1,549 of these vehicles are produced between March of 1941 and July of 1942. Okay. This sees some changes in the design. For starters, 50mm of frontal armour becomes the standard. It's not 2 bits welded together, it is just the standard. This is armour on the superstructure, the hull, and along the rear. The turret, however, remains the same. It remains the same 30mm. This brings weight up to 21.5 tons, which is actually down on the H's model just by a little bit. And it also sees the reduction in gears. The gearbox drops from, originally they were obviously 10 going forward, 4 going backwards. It now goes to 6 forward and 1 in reverse. This is obviously the sign of mass production is really starting to kick in. Let's simplify everything that we can. So armour is obviously increased. Everything else apart from one major thing remains the same. The Germans are modifying their armament. The machine gun in the coaxial position drops from 2 MG34s to just 1. This has been begun on a couple of other tanks, but with the Ausf J it becomes very common. Obviously you've got to make space for the larger breech on the 50mm gun. The newer thing that gets introduced, however, is that while the 5cm KWK L42 gun is obviously the standard basis for this vehicle, we start to see the slow introduction of the KWK 39 L60 gun, which is again another 5cm gun, but it's the long barreled one that everyone remembers for being the Germans' last gasp attempt at keeping this vehicle in service. That is obviously something that will be introduced a little bit later on. So, in terms of specific features itself, obviously armour is upgraded, various other things are done, such as there's a smoke rack introduced to obviously help conceal the vehicle. There is new air intakes designed because this thing is now seeing service in North Africa. It's also seeing service on the Eastern Front, where dust and sand and all that is getting lodged everywhere. There's also some modifications made by adding 20mm of spaced armour on the gun mantlet to some variants of the vehicle. We don't see this in abundance, but it has been spotted. This is obviously done as a bit of a last gasp attempt to try and stop things like anti-tank rounds, or more likely things like anti-tank rifle rounds and heat weapons, to the point from punching through the armor, because obviously you have spaced armor, you hit it with a heat round, yeah, it might punch clean through the first bit of armor, but then it will dissipate into the rest of the armor. So in terms of combat service, they were used to initially equip the 2nd and 5th Panzer Divisions and an independent Panzer detachment, which was sent as reinforcements to Russia in September of 1941. The remainder are used to replace losses across the front line. Okay, they replace 1,400 Panzer IIIs during the first year of fighting in Russia and North Africa. At the start of the summer campaign on the Eastern Front in 1942, approximately 500 Panzerkampfwagen IIIs of this variation were in the Panzer divisions at the front. A year later, at the start of the offensive in Kursk, there was 141 of these. This is what the fighting on the Eastern Front ultimately does. It just sucks the German army dry of its tanks, effectively. The Germans begin to modify the tanks in December of 1941 to take the L-60 gun, as we talked about previously. Just over 1,000 of these vehicles would be produced between December 1941 and July of 1942. Weight of the vehicle did increase very, very slightly to accommodate the gun. Everything else pretty much remained the same. Initially, these vehicles were issued to 5 tank detachments, which were formed in early 1942, these being the 3rd, 16th, 29th and 60th Motorised Infantry Divisions and the 5th SS Motorised Infantry Division Viking. The remainder were used to replace the extremely high losses which had been sustained in Russia and North Africa. The long gun was very useful in North Africa when it could engage the things like the Grants and the Valentines, which the British were fielding, but it was not so good against the Russian T-34 or KV-1. It could do it, it was possible, but you didn't really want to be a German tanker in that position, you know. So briefly before we move on to the next major iteration, very briefly we just want to look at the K variant. It's not a standard Panzer III model, it's an armoured command tank, about 50 of which are built. However, I need to bring this up for a personal reason, because for me personally, this vehicle is special because unlike other command panzers, this is one of the first which keeps the gun as an armament. Okay, it's used the short-barreled gun, but it still keeps it as an armament, which up until this point other command tanks haven't been doing. So that's the only major modification, is the fact that it takes on command equipment and keeps the main gun. So I just want to mention that because I felt if I didn't, I'd be doing the tank a disservice. We move into the Ausf L, which again is just essentially it's the Ausf J, but has the long-barreled gun from the start. It does, however, take the 20mm of standoff or spaced armour that became common to see on the J and makes them a standard. It makes them pretty much standard issue amongst production. So this is designed to help decrease the effectiveness of both anti-tank rifles and shape-charged ammunition, which actually becomes really handy when they start facing the Americans with their bazookas, because all of a sudden bazookas hit the front of the Panzer IIIs and they just don't work. So the L would prove to be one of the most effective models that see service throughout the war. 653 of these vehicles would be produced between June and December of 1942 and would begin to see service as late as June of 1942. So they begin life at the start of the summer offensive. They fight alongside units in Russia. Apart from replacing losses, these are issued to three newly formed, sorry, not to three, to a number of newly formed Panzer regiments, those of the 1st, 2nd and 3rd SS Panzer divisions, that being Leibstandarte SS Adolf Hitler, Das Reich and Totenkampf respectively, and the Panzer Grenadier Division Großdeutschland. So the spaced armour in and of itself effectively makes the front armour of these tanks about 70mm, but it doesn't really stop a solid kinetic shot. It will just do things like prevent shaped charged ammunition from punching through by basically setting it off early. So with that being said, this will actually help us understand why the Germans then do what they do at the Ausf M. So the M is the last model to be equipped with a gun designed for fighting other tanks. This model begins its production in October of 1942 through to February of 1943, in which 250 of them are produced. Again, armament remains the same. There's a little bit of modifications made to the side armour, but we'll get into why that happened. So, as early as March 1942, the OKH, the Oberstkommander here has pretty much decided to replace the Panzer III with the Panther. That's done. That's sorted. So it's decided that in July, the order for the final 1,000 Panzerkampfwagens, which were to be the Ausf M, is cut. It's cut back to about 775 variants, and then it's cut back further by the decision to use the chassis to build the Stug. So another 165 then get put aside for that job. They then decide to build the N variant, which we'll get into, which then takes more vehicles out of the production cycle. It takes about 600 vehicles out of that cycle. And so eventually, of the original 1,000 Ausf Ms which are ordered, 250 are complete as Ausf Ms. They are most notoriously known for being the Panzer IIIs with the side skirts, or the Schutzen as they're referred to in German. This is probably their most recognisable feature. So the Schutzen, which means apron armour, effectively stops things like shape-charged ammunition. Again, this is because they've encountered things like the bazooka, which the Russians are also getting as well. The Brits will start using things like the Piat. It's basically just to stop things like shape-charged ammunition from punching through the side. So the Ausf Ms are mainly used to replace frontline losses. Again, this is just one of those things, they need them to replace the losses. Although it lost its effectiveness as a frontal tank versus tank action, there are still 432 Panzerkampfwagen 3s with the long-barreled gun in Army Group Centre and South at the start of Operation Citadel, also known as the offensive at Kursk, in July of 1943. At the same time, about 49 of these vehicles have been issued for the defence of Sicily. So the Ausf M gets produced with the sole purpose basically being cover losses, hope the Panther gets into service in time, let's just get it sorted. It does have another really quite weird feature about it, in the fact that it has a deeper wading exhaust. Yeah, basically the Germans had decided that they were going to use these things to wade rivers whenever they needed to, because they could just do that apparently. We get to the last iteration of the combat Panzer IIIs. No, I'm not going to be talking about the various other iterations of the Panzer III that did see service. Those will get their own special video, because this video is already 40 minutes long, and I need to edit the whole damn thing. So the Panzerkampfwagen III Ausf N is the last gasp effort of the Germans to basically keep this thing in service. 700 are built, 663 were initially produced, and then 37 are converted from rebuilt Panzer IIIs. The whole purpose of this vehicle is um, is to basically just keep the thing in service as an anti-tank, as an anti-infantry unit. It switches the 50mm L60 gun and switches it for the 7.5cm KWK-37 L24 gun. Sorry, which is actually what the Panzer IV was initially being armed with way back in 1937. So these things effectively replaced the role that the Panzer IV was meant to be, whilst the Panzer IV replaces the Panzer III, which I think is kind of funny to think about. So obviously the specific features of the vehicle is the addition of this new 75mm gun. The weight of the tank jumps to 23 tons. It is a pretty significant jump. It's heavier than any other preceding Panzer III of its kind. Again, same engine, same suspension, same just about everything with the exception of the gun. Armour remains the same. Yeah. These are produced between June of 1942 and August of 1943. The conversions are also made during this time, and they begin seeing service as soon as September of 1942. They are issued to heavy tank companies who want them to be used as close support for their heavy armour. They want to have 10 Panzer III Ns to render close support for 9 Tigers. This is obviously a problem with forming independent heavy panzer battalions, is that often you don't have the ability to support them with anything else. In addition, the Ns were issued to panzer regiments in time for parts of the Kursk offensive, and then were issued to various garrisons. It's a known fact that a large amount of the Ns were actually sent to Norway as they feared the Allies would land there next, so they were sent there as a last resort. They see action in Tunisia, they see action in Russia, they see a little bit of action on the Western Front, but that is a real sort of, things have hit the fan and we need to just throw whatever we can at the situation. And it's basically just the last gasp of the Panzer IIIs. So obviously we've covered a brief bit of information about obviously the combat history. There isn't really any need to go into any further detail apart from just the fact that knowing that even as early as the battles in France, the vehicle was highly effective, and obviously that then fell off over time. It is important to note that a very small number of them were used as part of part of the fighting in both Normandy and during Operation Market Garden. However, they fail almost utterly in their role as being tank hunters. There are Shermans, there are Cromwells, there are Churchills. There is going to be nothing that they can do. I tried to see if I could find anything to do with around any major sources from primary accounts. There's not much, but all I can imagine, with the greatest of respect, is a Panzer III moving around a corner and suddenly being encountered with a Sherman Firefly pointing a great big 17-pounder at him, which I think would be, well, kind of funny to think about, obviously with a little bit of respect on the side. The last real thing we'll talk about is just foreign use. The Panzer III does see service abroad. In 1943, 22 Ausf M vehicles are sent to Turkey. It is hoped that this will keep the Turks on side with the Germans rather than them ultimately doing what they do, which is declare war. These vehicles are kept and are used for training and drill up until about the 60s, until they're eventually scrapped. In the spring of 1944, the Army of the Independent State of Croatia receives 4 Model Ms to help its own army, whilst the fascist militia receives 20 that autumn to help end partisan operations. Most of these vehicles are destroyed against both the partisans and then subsequently when the Soviets turn up. Romania receives a vast number of vehicles for its first armoured division in 1943. most of which would then almost immediately be turned on the Germans once the Romanians switched sides. 2 vehicles are active in 1945, most of which are then sent to form the Romanian defences. Most of which are sent to Bulgaria to form defence against Turkey. As mentioned previously, Norway had a huge number of ex-Panzers left over, along with things like Stugs and that. And they were used to fill out the Norwegian defence force until about the 1950s, when they're replaced by their conventional designs. The Soviets got very ingenious with the Panzer III and developed 2 vehicles based off captured Panzer III chassis. The SG-122, which is a self-propelled howitzer, and the Su-76I assault gun. These 2 vehicles effectively just mount Soviet weaponry upon the Panzer III. The Soviets primarily tend to use these vehicles as sort of second-line vehicles and didn't really bother to throw them into combat very often, and the vast majority of them are scrapped at the end of the war. Obviously, then we wouldn't really be finished without talking about Japan buying 2 vehicles in 1942, as it did with just about anything that was German tank related. One was a 50mm gun, the other was a 75mm. They planned to reverse engineer them for their own production, which never amounts to anything significant, and the vehicles were bought back by the Germans and then thrown into action in a desperate attempt to keep the Soviets away. So yeah, that pretty much sums up the Panzer III. I've gone through all the major variations, I've gone through some foreign use. Yeah, I hope you enjoyed this video. I know it's a long one, but thank you very much for sticking around. Please like, subscribe, tell me what you think in the comments below, and yeah, I'll see you on the next one.